All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started this morning. Since we don't have anyone to speak to the study slide, which is the same as last week, I'm just going to make a quick announcement that on December 1st, we have coming up a cardiovascular update for primary care providers with a focus on valvular heart disease. It is for primary care providers, but we would greatly appreciate it if you could spread the word to your primary care colleagues. We've got stacks of postcards out there if you go to clinics and can bring some to your clinics to share with the providers there. We would appreciate it. Thank you, and I will pass it off to Dr. Bradley.
Sure, I think I got it.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Let me turn this on. So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you. I awoke this morning dreaming that I'd swallowed a paperclip, and I think that's because it was the bitter pill of watching the Vikings blow 3 field goals. I can't quite figure out. It's not because I'm nervous to speak with you folks. I'm excited about this opportunity, but something's got me riled up. At any rate, pleasure to speak with you today about pragmatic clinical research, early lessons from PCORNet. So my objectives, first of all, I need to provide a warning. I am not a clinical trialist. Never been a clinical trialist, but all of a sudden I've been pulled into the world of clinical trials. So there was a lot for me to be learned by me. I did not design the studies we'll discuss, so as you look at them, you say, why would they ask such a stupid question? Don't shoot the messenger. But I think I'm more interested in what this framework means for pragmatic clinical research and what it means in terms of where we're going in terms of pragmatic clinical trials. So the objectives are to first talk about why PCORNet was created, what it will do for research, how it works, or at least how it's intended to work, and lessons that I've learned along the way, and I think that we as a team have learned along the way. So first, why was PCORNet created? Our national research system doesn't work particularly well. There have been prior studies, particularly in cardiovascular disease, that talk about more than half of the decisions that we make in clinical practice are not evidence-based. They're based on essentially our expert opinion. And if you think about cardiovascular disease as where the predominance of understanding and research lies, think about other fields of medicine, it's got to be a lot worse. And part of that is that our current system to generate evidence is too slow. It takes on the order of decades to answer single questions. It's too expensive, on the order of multi-millions of dollars to enroll patients in these studies and find our answers. At times it's unreliable in the sense that we don't, despite all of that money and energy that we put in, we don't get evidence out of it at the end. We have had studies from NIH that have looked at the number of trials that end up with publications, and it's a low percentage or lower than you'd like to see. It doesn't answer questions that most matter to patients and clinicians. Patients and clinicians oftentimes aren't involved in the decision or the process of deciding what question we're going to ask, and as a result, the question becomes important potentially to an industry that wants us to sell a specific therapy, but not necessarily important to our patients and to our clinicians. And then as a result of all these problems, the money and the infrastructure that's needed to do this work is unattractive to clinicians and administrators. So as a result, we're not generating the evidence we need to support the healthcare decisions that we make every day for our patients. We need to do better. So the question then becomes, what if we could have high-quality data at our fingertips that would allow us to answer questions with real-world data and answer real-world questions? What if we could decrease the amount of time it takes to get to those answers? And what if we could save a lot of money as a result? And so PCORNet was really generated with this concept in mind, this learning healthcare system in mind, the idea of using data obtained in routine clinical practice to generate a highly representative national patient-centered clinical research network. So the vision is to use data captured in routine care to result in a large-scale clinical research network with enhanced quality and efficiency so we can get those questions answered for the questions that are important to us with less time and less money. And the mission is to help people make informed healthcare decisions by providing those answers that we need. There are a number of objectives in the generation of PCORNet. So first, creating this infrastructure, this national resource that will enable teams of researchers, clinicians, patients, and their partners to work together, this idea of collaboration on the questions of interest in answering those questions. Utilizing the rich data resources that are at hand, so recognizing that we've got increasing data that comes from our routine clinical practice, from insurance claims data, and from other patient generated data. We can use that data to answer important questions. Engaging patients, clinicians, and administrators and health system leaders in identifying what are the important questions and working to work on those questions. So instead of generating these questions in a silo and then bringing them to the Clinical Research Network, doing that it is a collaborative effort to make sure the questions that we answer are important to our patients and to our providers. Supporting both observational and interventional research studies that will help us understand the current practice that we're providing, the current care that we're providing, and where we should go going forward. To enable others to partner with this. So obviously if you generate this infrastructure, you want to be able to partner with industry and other partners who would like to use that to understand and answer questions that are important, and then sustain that with that partnership. A big part of this was engagement, to making sure that we've engaged with patients, clinicians, and health systems. So this was a big challenge for us moving forward. So when PCORI first came out, a big part of this was collaborating with patients to generate the questions of interest. Now we've got a network that's taking randomized clinical trials to us, so we have to figure out how we're going to engage with patients and clinicians to answer these questions of interest that have already been designed. So why is traditional clinical research so slow and costly? Why is there this problem that the PCORNet needs to address? So let's first think about how data is generated in care delivery. When we provide care to patients, we generate a ton of data. So if we do a physical exam, we document that exam, that is data. We obtain lab work, the results of those labs, those are data. We have images. Those images can actually be thought of as data as well. But for the longest time, that data was captured in a paper format. Somebody would either write down their exam, the labs would come back in a paper format, but not structured data. And that paper is fine if we want to look at single individual patients, but if we want to understand across the population of patients, that requires a tremendous amount of additional work and energy to understand. So we've certainly been successful in that, things like the Level 1 program, where we do directed data abstraction to understand in very detailed granularity about the specific patient population. But if you haven't built out the infrastructure for that patient population, you can't ask those additional questions. So you're limited to where you've demonstrated or built out that infrastructure. So as a result, for other patient populations, you can't find patterns, trends, or talk about outcomes. You can't make complex comparisons because you're limited to the individual patient for whom you have the paper record. You don't have that structured in a way that you can look across patient populations. And you can't identify important patient populations to ask questions of. So say you have a question that you want to ask and you say, boy, how many of those patients do I have in my clinic? If you don't have that in a structured way, you have no way of knowing. We have no way of knowing how many patients have coronary disease, heart failure, or other conditions if we don't have this in a structured format rather than just a paper document. So what can we do with electronic health records? So electronic health records, the idea is if we're moving from this paper to an electronic format, it's not just about putting it into an electronic file cabinet, but actually creating structured data elements that essentially allow us to put these things into tables that we can then ask questions of. It allows us to generate what are called computable phenotypes. So what does that mean? So that means if I've got the data structured in my electronic health record, I can go and ask the electronic health record questions like, show me all patients who are age 18 to 65 who have been diagnosed with coronary disease and who have been seen in our outpatient clinics in the past year. And then I also need to know if they're taking these medications and have had blood pressure readings greater than 140 or lab values over X for X condition in the past year. So all of a sudden we've got data that's structured in a way that we can ask these questions and start to identify patient populations of interest that both we can look at what's the care that's been delivered. That's the type of thing that Craig and I do constantly as part of the Healthcare Delivery Innovation Center. And we can also partner and use that data to identify patients of interest that we might want to study or intervene upon to see if we can understand specific research questions. But now what if we wanted to do that across many different healthcare systems across our country? So I talked about the Healthcare Delivery Innovation Center. That data is structured in a way that we can ask questions of the care that we provide at Minneapolis Heart Institute or Allina, but it's not necessarily structured in a way that we can compare apples to apples across different healthcare systems. So we need to think about how we address that question. Because it can be hard, again, the data is designed for our local needs. It's designed to help us address those questions that are important locally, but the data is not designed for collaboration. And in addition, if you think about the regulatory requirements for research, doing that in a multi-site process can be daunting and confusing. So PCORNet is designed to address those problems. So first, what will PCORNet do for research? The idea is to generate these clinical data research networks that allow us to create the structured data to overcome those problems that I talked about. So how does that work? So again, the common data model allows us to identify, allows us to collaborate and look at data across sites. So our data is coded and structured in a way that's helpful for us, but if we want to share it, we need to think about a structure where the apples that we're looking at our healthcare system aren't oranges in another. We need an apples-to-apples comparison. Why is that a problem? Or first of all, sorry, so emphasizing a common data structure as a result, we now have ways that we can look at and share data in common ways. You'll see that there are problems. We're never going to get to a red delicious as a red delicious, but we'll get to a red delicious as a Granny Smith, close enough that we can start to identify patient populations where we can ask questions of. And for the pure clinical trialists who are used to a structure in which they can be very, very deliberate about the patient populations who are part of their process that causes some discomfort, and certainly we'll talk about what that can potentially mean for research questions. So let's use an example of what data might look like at individual sites and why you can't necessarily just out of the box compare this across sites. So site 1 might talk about race as Caucasian, African American, Asian, multiple race, or blank. Site 2 might talk about those races as codes that then link to a different category of race, and we don't know what those codes mean. And another site might have more or less categories of race, and as a result, you can see the challenges of trying to compare across different sites. So we need to create a common data value, common data model where certain elements populate into the same spot in a registry so we can compare those across different sites. So we need to do that for every variable we're interested in looking at. So you can think about very quickly the amount of work and energy that's required to identify data elements that you can look at across sites. So what types of data are we interested in? We're interested in vital status, condition, demographic, biospecimen, genomic, procedures, claims, encounters, lab results, prescribing, patient satisfaction, and it goes on and on. This is actually just kind of a starting point. You can generate additional patient-generated data they might capture in their day-to-day life, and you can think about how complicated that becomes. This is like the hottest lamp I've ever stood underneath. I should have skipped the workout this morning, apparently. Those deadlifts are getting to me. So how do we think about data federation, allowing for controlled data sharing? So again, individual sites are not going to be allowed to directly share across institutions. Allina has no interest whatsoever in sharing our data with the Mayo healthcare system, in the same way that the VA never had any interest in sharing their data outside of the VA. But if we want to do this multi-site comparisons, we need to think about ways that we can integrate vertically and then allow us to do this horizontally in a way that sites are protected. So the way we do that is this common data model that's then de-identified, and then we can kind of pull down from this federal query to identify patients of interest for individual sites and think about how we do this work across sites. So these CDRNs, so again, common clinical data research networks, common data model across each site. PCORNet stood up 14 of these different clinical data research networks. LHSNet is the Learning Healthcare Systems Network, with Mayo Clinic being the coordinating center, and Allina Health was a part of this. So starting in 2015, Allina started to participate in this and created their common data model and their clinical data research network as part of Tamara Winden's work. Tamara was here for 2 years, and then they were looking for someone who would help out in next steps, and that's where I became involved, and we'll talk about that. So again, a national network for research. We can see all of the different research networks that are involved and all the different patient populations. There are, at this point, and this is from 6 months ago, so the number of patients and lives covered has grown since then. More than 128 million patients who have had a medical encounter in the past 5 years across this network, so this becomes a very robust network in terms of population of patients served. When we think about the demographics that are involved, so very closely mapped to U.S. Census data. So oftentimes when we talk about doing clinical research, we become very focused on specific populations, and it becomes difficult to generalize across our U.S. population. We're now talking about a population that's representative of our country as a whole, so it becomes more representative and generalizable as we start to do these research questions, and issues of generalizability become less concerning. When we think about specific conditions, so this is for about half of our data marks. These are the conditions, the number of patients who have these conditions. Diabetes, almost 500,000. Pulmonary disease, 2 million. Hypertension, 3.5 million. Very powerful in terms of numbers and patients who have these diseases. So a very powerful resource to try and do research and understand these important questions. And it becomes particularly relevant for clinical trials. So our current challenges in randomized trials, there's a lot of complexity in the operational work. There's waning patient participation, site and patient participation. There are regulatory issues, and it's inefficient and costly. If we have a network where we can identify nationally patients who are eligible for specific trials, specific questions, it simplifies our approach to identifying those patients that will be involved. We can get larger sample sizes with more representative populations as we've demonstrated in comparison to U.S. Census data, fewer restrictions in terms of who can participate, and we can try and embed these processes in routine clinical care. So instead of generating a whole separate infrastructure in which we go and identify patients, we recruit them, we capture their data in 6 and 12-month follow-up as a separate process. Instead, we try and embed that in routine clinical care, so we capture patients at the point of care, and their outcomes are captured as part of the care that we provide on a routine basis, thus making it more efficient, reducing the costs, and improving the efficiency, reducing the time to generate important answers. So now let's move on from that idealized, how it is intended to work, and talk about how it's actually working and the lessons that we've learned along the way. So a repeat warning, again, I'm not a clinical trialist. We'll discuss some studies that have been developed and been implemented across this PCORNet network. And again, my interest is more in the infrastructure that PCORNet provides, what that means for us going forward, and what I think that means for clinical research. So my invitation to participate in LHSNet came after Tamara Winden stepped away 2 years into this process. So Tamara Winden is an informaticist, and she was instrumental in building out the process of creating our common data model. So she had worked with our analysts to create the common data model, the data infrastructure that's necessary to do observational and build randomized clinical trial data questions on top of it. They'd been successfully participating, but that PI was leaving Allina. And I don't know why, but for some reason, somebody found me and said, would you like to help us lead the next steps? We think that you have an understanding of data and infrastructure, and the next steps are really going to be important about engaging clinicians, and you're one of those. So it would be great to have you serve as our PI, so as we move into randomized clinical trials, we can be successful in this. And they said, you know, it's only going to be probably like an hour, maybe 2 a week. And I said, you know, this sounds really exciting. This is where we're going in research. I'd like to be a part of that. I'm not interested in clinical trials, but I know that my colleagues are, and I'd like to help us be successful in moving forward. So absolutely, I'm happy to be that sucker. So, so let's first talk about my view of clinical research. And I've talked about the challenges with clinical research in terms of inefficiencies, costs, and not answering questions. But at the same time, it's an important bridge. So we'll generate new therapies, we'll generate new devices, and we need a bridge to translate that basic science learning into our understanding of what happens at the bedside, what happens in clinical practice. And so that bridge is very important. But that bridge is at risk because it's so expensive and we need to maintain it. I'll use an analogy. So this is the Cholulteca Bridge in Honduras. And so this was a very important bridge, but there was concern that it was at risk for storms and at risk of sounding insensitive given that there is an important hurricane going on right now. They wanted to build a new bridge that was essentially resistant to hurricanes, couldn't be destructed, and would continue to serve this important bridge for the community. And so they spent all the time and money in putting that bridge, and a year after they put that bridge into place, Hurricane Mitch came through and wiped out everything. But the bridge remained standing. There was one problem. The river moved. So I think, you know, I look at clinical research and where we are now, and I see, to me, the river is moving. We're moving towards a process where we're going to increasingly leverage the data that we have at hand, increasingly leverage the data that's already available, and increasingly try to become more efficient and rapid in addressing questions that are important. And so I wanted to be part of creating that new bridge that would span that new process and leverage the data that we have, be a part of this new process in randomized clinical trials. So my view is that we are moving towards this pragmatic clinical design, and we as an organization needed to be a part of that process so that we could continue to be successful in the work that we did. So what are the demonstration projects that have come out of PCORNet, and what has that taught us thus far? So I'm going to talk about 2 demonstration projects. One is actually in its second year with the INVESTED trial, and then the adaptable aspirin dosing. So INVESTED, influenza vaccine to effectively stop cardiothoracic events and decompensated heart failure, and adaptable, the aspirin dosing trial, patient-centric trial addressing benefits and long-term effectiveness of adaptable. So the INVESTED trial, this is the influenza vaccine trial. So more than 35,000 patients who have influenza each flu season, over 200,000 influenza-related excess hospitalization, and there have been a number of studies that have demonstrated association between flu or respiratory infections and bad outcomes in terms of cardiovascular events. This one comes from the New England Journal in 2004. They looked at the association between influenza and myocardial infarction rates and stroke events after an influenza or after a respiratory infection. And so what you're seeing in blue is soon after a respiratory infection, the incidence of myocardial infarction goes up 5-fold and then decreases over time, so demonstrating a relationship between a respiratory event and myocardial infarction. Similarly with stroke, after a respiratory infection, your risk of stroke goes up 3-fold in the days afterwards, but a similar association is not seen for an influenza vaccine, demonstrating that flu vaccine is safe. If we can prevent respiratory infections, potentially we can prevent myocardial infarctions and strokes in high-risk patients. There have been a number of studies then that were analyzed in a meta-analysis that again demonstrated that flu vaccine reduces cardiovascular risk. So collaborating on all of these studies demonstrating that flu vaccine reduces the risk of cardiovascular events. But we know for certain patients that their response to the flu vaccine isn't as robust as others. So in particular, heart failure patients, after they get a flu vaccine, their antibody response is somewhat blunted relative to healthy controls. So on the left figure, we're seeing patients with heart failure and their antibody response to flu vaccine, and we can see that it's not as high as that of healthy controls. And so the question becomes, are they actually generating an antibody response that will protect them from the flu if they're exposed? Similarly, antibody titers with a high-dose vaccine, we see that with double the dose, their antibody titers are increased, so potentially a higher dose flu vaccine would be more protective to patients with heart failure and reduce their risk of cardiovascular events. So that's where this trial comes in, the influenza vaccine to effectively stop cardiothoracic events and decompensated heart failure. So we're looking at a post-MI and heart failure population and randomizing them into either a high-dose vaccine or a standard dose vaccine with the intent of seeing can we reduce events in patients with heart failure by exposing them to a higher dose of influenza vaccine. So what makes this pragmatic? So the doses are actually allowed to fluctuate year to year. So depending on the type of the dose and the actual size of the dose can fluctuate year to year. As we all know, the flu vaccine changes each year depending on what they think is coming out, and they change the potency of it. And so they're allowed to change that over time. It's pragmatic. It's allowed to fluctuate with clinical practice. It's straightforward in terms of its inclusion criteria. It's intended to minimize restrictions and make sure that it's generalizable. The recruitment leverages the electronic health record. So from this common data model, we can go and say, show us all patients who have been hospitalized for heart failure within a certain period of time, and show us who of those patients are going to be seen in clinic in the next couple of weeks, so we can tell our recruitment team, these are the patients you need to go after in the next couple of weeks. They don't need to do it. The intent is that they avoid needing to do any type of screening. They just go and interact with the patient, engage them, get them involved, and it's a quote-unquote one-shot deal. There's no additional therapies that need to happen afterwards, and then all of the longitudinal process in terms of follow-up happens remotely through the electronic health record and through engaging the patient through an electronic portal. The endpoint ascertainment is simple and requires minimal adjudication, so again, all these aspects make it pragmatic. Again, querying from the common data model to identify patients who will be eligible, our enrollment criteria, making sure they're following up in Allina Health, and having an upcoming visit allows us to target those patients that will engage and recruit. And then as a result of this targeted recruitment, Allina was actually the leading enroller for all of the PCORNet work for this trial. So very successful, very encouraging. Here's the numbers led by Frank Rame as the PI for this project. And I was extremely excited by our success. And so at this point, I'm feeling very happy. I'm not hurt at all. We're doing great. We're enrolling well. But after I had given this talk actually to Allina Research Network, or parts of this talk, to an Allina Research meeting about 6 months ago, I was approached by the recruitment team for this trial afterwards. They said, that's not what's happening at all. You're giving us a list of patients from your common data model, and either none of them apply, or we're doing additional screening, or we're doing a tremendous amount of work. So what you're describing in practice would be great. That's really what we want, but that's not what's happening at all. I said, well, it really troubles me that I didn't know that, so thank you for bringing that to my attention, and clearly we have work to do. And when we walk through the ADAPTABLE trial, we'll start to see examples of why a common data model may not get us to where we need to be when it comes to recruitment for patients. So I went from no hurt, things are going great, to this is starting to hurt a little bit more. We've got some work to do if we're going to actually achieve what we need from this Pragmatic research network. So let's move on to ADAPTABLE and see what we learned from that trial. So what if there was an over-the-counter choice that had tremendous impacts in terms of either reducing deaths from heart attack by 19,000 a year, or, depending on the dose you use, increasing bleeds by thousands that happened annually in the United States? That was the question that was posed about aspirin. As we all know the importance of the platelets in the cardiovascular events and the role that aspirin has in reducing the risk of cardiovascular events by platelet inhibition. Proven clinical benefit in reducing ischemic vascular events. It's cost effective. We've demonstrated a combination with antiplatelet therapies for years, but there's issues. We don't know whether there's equal efficacy across patients. There have been the recent studies that have looked at weight in relation to aspirin dosing that came out after this trial was put into process, but that raises questions. There may be issues of aspirin tolerance. There may be issues of aspirin resistance or interaction with other P2L5 inhibitors. And when it comes down to it, we have no idea what the most effective dose is. So this is the question that was starting to percolate through PCORNet work as they started to think about demonstration projects. We know that there's clinical equipoise when we look at how we use aspirin nationally in our country. Patients who are on aspirin after a cardiovascular event, about 2/3 of them are on 325, about 1/3 of them are on 81, and 3% are somewhere in between. I think that 3% is probably Reno. And there's also tremendous variation across our hospitals in terms of the use of high-dose aspirin. So essentially, depending on where you practice, that's what you do. I happen to have always practiced in an 81 milligram setting, and so that's just kind of what I do all the time, but I've got no evidence to support that. In actuality, the one randomized trial that's ever looked at this, current OASIS, suggests there may be benefit for a higher dose, but it was a small study, only looked at 30 days, and so the question still remains, what's the optimal dose for aspirin in patients with prior cardiovascular events? So this trial was intended to compare the efficacy and effectiveness and safety of 2 doses of aspirin, 81 and 325 in high-risk patients with coronary artery disease. The primary endpoints were a composite of mortality, non-fatal MI, and non-fatal stroke, and the primary safety endpoint is bleeding. And the intent is to have a large enough patient population in size that are randomized that we can look at important subgroups, men versus women, older versus younger, racial and ethnic minorities. Not on here is obesity, but certainly that would be a part of it given what we've seen recently with the relationship between weight and dosing. Diabetics versus non-diabetics, the list goes on and on. So not only in a generalized sense what seems to be better, but for specific patient populations, what appears to be the best dose of aspirin in terms of preventing secondary events in these high-risk patients. In addition is to develop and refine the infrastructure for PCORNet so we can learn from this trial to do future trials along the same lines. So how does this all work? So again, using our common data model, we can go to that common data model and say, who are the patients who fit the enrollment criteria? And we'll go over to those to some degree to talk about the issues there. But once we've identified those patients, can we engage those patients in a low-touch process so we're not spending a lot of time and energy and resources on trying to recruit, but just say, hey, this is an over-the-counter therapy that you're already taking. What do you think about being involved in this trial? And then through that low-touch process, enrolling 20,000 patients that would then enroll in a web portal. So instead of necessarily requiring a patient to walk them through the process, they'd go to a web portal that would walk them through individually about about providing consent and then the process of providing their routine follow-up. That web portal, again, would serve as the same process for them to engage in follow-up. And then for additional events, they'd look at the common data model and data that's captured from the electronic data warehouse. So all of this intended to reduce the cost of enrollment, reduce the cost of follow-up, and get us to the question in a much more timely way that we would have in the past. And if we think about cost comparisons and timeliness relative to prior studies, so ADAPTABLE was scoped out at costing $850 per patient, so 20,000 patients, a total of $17 million total cost. PROMISE, which is also a type of pragmatic trial, but a little bit more of this required in terms of engagement, enrollment, and follow-up, $3,000 per patient. And BRIDGE, which is a traditional randomized control trial, 1/20th or 1/10th of the patient population at the same cost, $13,000 per participant. So you start to see the potential gains in increasing the efficiency, reducing the cost of enrollment and follow-up for these patients. So what did this actually look like in practice? We'll start to talk about why I went from it hurts a little more to it hurts a whole lot. So one of the first things that we needed to do was determine whether or not we could identify patients from the common data model that we would go approach either in a low-touch process or in clinical practice to say, hey, you're eligible for this trial. So what we did was vet that computable phenotype. We were given, these are the patients who are eligible. They include patients with a prior MI, prior PCI or CABG, corneal angio with greater than 75% stenosis, a history of chronic ischemic heart disease, coronary disease, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Those are eligible. No aspirin safety concerns. They're not on an anticoagulant or ticagrelor, and they need one of these enrichment factors. So myself, as someone who plays with data a lot and thinks about structured data and coded data, I look at this and I instantly see problems. And I'm curious if there's anyone else out there who instantly sees a problem about, I'm going to go to electronic record and identify patients with, let's take the example of prior MI. Anybody looked at a positive troponin recently that wasn't really a MI that we're concerned about in terms of a type 1 plaque rupture event? So that's the type of thing that I see. I wonder, all right, so how many patients are we going to capture that actually were in for sepsis, had a troponin bump, but we don't really know that they have coronary disease? Similarly, a patient with a history of heart failure, how many of those are patients who had Takotsubo's cardiomyopathy, had heart failure, were in the hospital, but now they're doing entirely better, and they're not really a population that we think of as being at increased risk for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So when we did this initial vetting of the computable phenotype, we took 100 patients who met these criteria and then did chart review to see how many of them really had coronary disease, really were at increased risk. It was like 50% because of those types of issues that I identified. So we had to go through and revise what our query was going to look like to capture the patient of interest. Let's say that they had an MI, but we need another coded event within the year and perhaps 2 coded events within 2 years. Then we went from 50% to around 90% because we're capturing patients who truly have cardiovascular disease who are being followed over time for that atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. But if you think about every time we think of a question, if we have to go through that process, all of a sudden some of the efficiency opportunities are incredibly reduced. And so as a result of that process, I went from being little pain to a little bit more pain. Let's talk about the recruitment approach. So what was pushed on us over and over and over again by the leadership from the ADAPTABLE trial was to try and use low-touch engagement processes so that we would create this pragmatic approach. And what they really wanted us to do was send letters to our patient population. They wanted us to send emails and letters to say, you're eligible for this study. We'd like you to consider enrolling. And so we built out this approach in which we would send an email and letter to a patient. We followed up with another. And ideally, we try and target those patients we were going to see in clinical practice and follow up so we could talk to them more. But the idea is we would convert some of these patients just by sending them a letter, just that simple process. But at the same time that we were working on that, I started to become very clear that letters were not going to work. And it related to work we were doing as part of the Healthcare Delivery Innovation Center. So as part of that work, we were interested in improving the care of patients with familial hyperlipidemia. For those that don't know, familial hyperlipidemia is a genetic condition in which your cholesterol are exceptionally high and are associated with a very high risk of cardiovascular events. It's very easy for us to use Allina's data to identify patients who have very high cholesterol levels and aren't on appropriate therapy to then try and engage with those patients and say, hey, you may have this condition that's genetic that affects you and your family members. We'd like you to come in and see one of our preventive cardiology docs to talk about it, confirm the diagnosis, and think about next steps. We worked with our primary care doctors about how we do that engagement process, and they said, we'd love it if we don't have to respond to another best practice alert, and we'd love it if we're not responsible for looking for a needle in a haystack, and instead we engage the patients directly. Let's try and send them a letter and see if we can't inform them of this condition and see what their response is. So we did that and sent letters to approximately 120 patients as part of a pilot process to see if we could do this. We got one patient who responded to it, created a clinical response. One patient was very, very grateful. They were incredibly grateful that we were being proactive in reaching out to them. But that less than 1% return isn't going to get us to where we need to be if we're going to do pragmatic research with a low-touch method. So at the same time that we were being somewhat less than successful in our patient engagement process, there was a threat that we were going to lose our funding from PCORNet. So PCORNet is funded in part by the Affordable Care Act. As part of the Affordable Care Act, they put aside, I don't remember how many millions of dollars to create PCORNet. Part of it was to support patient-centered research initiatives that are unrelated to the network. The other is related to the network to create this infrastructure for clinical trials. And now that the Affordable Care Act is funding, or PCORNet's funding is ending at the end of this year. PCORNet will exist no longer unless they transition to a different process. So they were in the process of transitioning to what's called the Patient-Centered Research Foundation, a foundational network that will support funding, and our network was not funded for renewal. So my enthusiasm to continue to push on and beat ourselves up as part of this trial became less and less. And so my hurts a whole lot was starting to become hurts the worst, because the time, energy, and effort we'd put in, and it wasn't clear that we were actually at that point that I had envisioned. We weren't at the point where we're building a bridge over a new world of clinical research. We were still not quite ready to be there. And that's just us. That's nationally. But as a result of the power of MHI and MHIF, there is an opportunity for a fresh start just ahead. So soon after we were informed that LHSNet and Mayo's leadership would not be refunded, we were engaged individually and asked if we would like to participate in a different network, and when they would provide funding for an additional 2 to 3 years to keep the lights on and allow us to continue to participate in this network and to continue to participate in pragmatic clinical research trials. So under the leadership of Vino, who I see sitting in the back, and Vani, we've looked to participate in that next step with the Great Plains Collaborative, if I remember, GPC, if I remember that correctly. And so there's the opportunity for us to continue this work. And as a result, I now see that we need to transition and rethink our approach. So this weekend, I got this beautiful picture of Mario in the mail, and I took a picture of it and sent it to him. He was glad to see that it reached the right address. But we need to rethink our approach. So I had really focused on this new process in which we were going to minimize work that was required by the clinicians, by our research engagement team, a low-touch approach of engaging patients in which it would happen as part of our routine processes, but at the same time be low cost and low touch. And now I understand that we're not there, and actually we need to leverage our experience and the team that we have to engage our interested clinicians at the point of care who will help us identify these patients and engage them in this research network. And in that way, we can be successful in the way that we have in many times in the past. So again, my view of clinical research has not changed. I do think that we're changing in terms of moving from a structure, this bridge that's taken us from the bench to the bedside. But I think that we need to think of the next steps as building from our existing bridge, not an entirely new bridge. We need to leverage what we already have in terms of our expertise in patient enrollment, patient engagement, including engagement of our clinicians to identify these patients and enroll them in these important trials. So there are other additional PCORNet studies in the early stages, and I just want to bring them up so people are aware of kind of the breadth of work that's being done by this network, both locally and nationally. So comparison of oral anticoagulants for extended venous thromboembolism, the COVET trial. So this is a trial in which Nita Skake is serving as PI, and we're looking at patients who have venous thromboembolism and comparing direct oral anticoagulants versus warfarin and specific dosing and specific timelines. Again, leveraging our common data model to identify patients who are eligible, refining that so we can identify the patients that we will approach, hopefully minimizing the screening process and the cost and time required to do that, and then engaging patients in routine clinical care to enroll them and follow up. The patient-reported outcomes investigation following initiation of drug therapy with Entresto. So Entresto, we know from randomized clinical trials that improves clinical outcomes in terms of reducing mortality, reducing readmission. But one of the things that the trial is intended to do here is really understand what are the impact on patient-reported patient-reported symptoms. So can we improve their functional status, their symptom burden, their health-related quality of life? So in this trial, we're identifying patients who are new starts on Entresto and comparing those to patients who have been stable on losartan and trying to identify what is the impact on their symptom burden, their functional status, and their health-related quality of life. This trial is great in the sense that all patients who are new starts, or almost all of them who are new starts, we can just go to Sam, our pharmacist, and say, can you tell us every time you put a patient on Entresto, making it very simple. The process of the controls I thought would actually be more complicated, but we at this point have more controls enrolled than we have Entresto patients, so we've done a good job. I've talked mostly about pragmatic interventional trials, so pragmatic clinical trials, but there's opportunities as well to do observational research. You can think about across this network, if we can identify patients who fit specific criteria, we can compare therapy versus A versus therapy B. We can also describe things like trends and prevalence of PCSK9 inhibitor use. Tom Nickelbein has helped in serving as a local PI for that study. We've done work looking at the epidemiology of prediabetes. We've sent out surveys to patients who meet specific criteria for obesity and heart failure that's allowed us to understand certain determinants of healthcare utilization and their outcomes. We've also done linkage for the TR registry that have allowed us to do additional studies and ask additional research questions for patients with structural heart disease. And as a result, there's an opportunity for many different types of research. We can think about how you can leverage this network to do pre-research questions, what's the feasibility, what engagement, what matchmaking is needed to make this work. We can do the interventional studies that I've talked about in terms of clinical trials, and those pragmatic clinical trials, moving more and more towards this low-touch method, but still a lot of work to be done to figure out how we do that best, and then cluster randomization, and then finally observational studies that we can look at the epidemiology, health services, and outcomes research for patients who receive specific therapies and care. So now we're re-engaged in a new day. I've gone from thinking that this was the worst thing that I've spent the past 6 months on ever to thinking that there's a continued opportunity for us to move forward. I'm excited for the opportunities that we have to engage in this new research process. And I think that this raises the platform for MHIF to continue to be participatory in a new framework for conducting research. So in conclusion, PCORNet, a national network of networks to support pragmatic research. It supports this, we need to bridge this new pragmatic approach with our traditional approach. We need to use our current bridge to this refined pragmatic approach, and we're really in the process of building that bridge. And it's important for us all to be participating in this changing research environment so in the next 10 years, when that river has moved, that we've created that bridge to be across it. With that, I'd like to thank the team of folks who've all been involved. It's been very important to me from the start to try and engage as many people as possible in this process so they can be aware of how research is changing. They can be involved in this new paradigm of conducting clinical trials, and so that we can demonstrate to our funders that we have broad clinical support and participation in this network. So our local MHIF team, our Allina LHSNet team that has been instrumental in creating our common data model and moving us forward, Vino, I apologize that your name didn't make the list. I haven't changed my slide adequately. And then our clinical study PIs who have been instrumental in helping us push this work forward. So with that, I'm happy to stop so I can stop sweating under these lights and answer your questions. Thank you. Mario, where's your Debbie Downer question?
Thank you, Steve, for letting us experience the pain you've suffered. The question has to do with your earlier comments, and that is, you're not, you mentioned the quality of the questions being asked. And I think to some of us, the questions being asked just really don't resonate to a great deal. And I wonder if you could comment on the importance of that in terms of spending all this money on research and how you formulate a good question and able to use in this environment.
Yeah, I think that, that's a great question, Scott, and that's why I put that warning disclaimer in twice, because I don't know that these would be the questions that I would have chosen to answer out of the gate. But at the same time, PCORI really invested heavily in this concept of engagement with patients. And so as a result of engaging with patients, I think sometimes we end up with questions that maybe we wouldn't have thought as being the most important as clinicians. But I think that demonstrates the tension between what's important to our patients and maybe what's important to us. This was a collaborative process in which they engaged patients with cardiovascular disease to say what's important to you. So although I don't know that I would have picked aspirin out of the box, apparently enough patients did that pushed the leadership towards this question. And also I think we need to think about what are the questions that are never going to get funded by industry or other groups. So this is an opportunity to think about those types of questions as well. So from that extent, I think it's fair. I think there's a lot to this question that suggests that in actuality it was the right place to start. In that we would never ask this question otherwise. There's a tremendous population potential in terms of better understanding what the right dose is in both reducing cardiovascular events and minimizing bleeding. And we wouldn't have gotten to that answer otherwise. Yes?
So, Steve, one of the questions about this a little bit is how, the design is the design. And on when you show the three examples, the two pragmatics for example, $850 per patient versus $3,500 per patient, but the mismatch between the total cost was 27 versus 37. So there's an awful lot built in. And in trials like this, a lot of times there's a lot of money, including indirects, that go to the main center, and a lot of advantage to the main center in terms of their names are on the papers, the data comes to them, they do that. So how's the value proposition for all of the sites out there that are actually doing the work?
I think that's a tremendously important question that I don't think that they've adequately addressed. So the first is the issue of indirects. So because of the idea of trying to do this on a shoestring, the amount of indirects or basically professional support is unbelievably small. It's basically just enough to kind of keep the common data model going, but then if you don't have the infrastructure to enroll a large number of patients, which is where the intent is that you'll get some back in terms of enrollment, you won't succeed. And so there really isn't that infrastructural support. Oftentimes that infrastructural support allows you not only to address the trial at hand, but to grow. And there's not enough support in terms of indirects in the current funding of the PCORNet network for any type of growth. It's just enough to keep the lights on. The other issue in terms of engagement, exactly, what's the incentive for folks like me who are not going to be on the paper to participate in this?
Or not everybody else on that slide.
Right. So I think they're trying to work through that. They've started to create work groups about how we're going to talk about the experiences in terms of clinician engagement, patient engagement, and there'll be additional work product that comes from that. But at the end of the day, what is the real benefit to, I think one of the strengths of PCORI is that they've tried to engage clinical, sorry, the pager is my own. I'm on service today, so the resident is informing me he'd like to meet. That's great. Where was I? Oh, one of the benefits of this network is that instead of just being limited to the ivory towers of academic research institutions, it really does engage community practice organizations. So, for example, LHSNet included Essentia Health to the north. It included Intermountain in Utah, and so by engaging those, we're now really truly generalizable in terms of our patient population, the population that we all serve. But they've not figured out how to engage those partners that it makes it worth their while to participate. For someone like myself to be somewhat jaded about participation, I think is a problem because I'm somewhat invested in this work, and so how do we make people who are even less invested want to participate and be a part of that? And I haven't heard from the leadership an answer to that question. Other questions? I do want to give a shout out to Scott. So Scott was part of Scott was the person who started to reframe my mindset and start to help me understand that, we've got this powerful group of people who are interested in answering these types of questions, and we need to engage with them to be successful in recruiting patients. When he first had that conversation with me is when I thought that we didn't have funding for this anymore, so I was kind of, yes, lesson learned, but now there's an opportunity to put that in practice moving forward. Great. I'm going to go meet my resident. Thanks all.
Thank you. On your way out, say hello to today's sponsors. We've got Pfizer and Novartis out there.